In this section of the Carbon County Centennial video, we start off with the area where the first white man entered the county. According to some historians, in October of 1812, an explorer named Stewart and 6 other Astorians entered the area below Antelope Hills and Green Mountain at Lost Soldier Gap near the present site of Bear Oil. They turned north and camped for 2 days at Muddy Gap and then followed Muddy Creek, first named Deep Ravine Creek, to the Sweetwater River. While traveling in Carbon County, they killed 2 buffalo bulls and a beaver. In the place where this party entered the county at Lost Soldier, oil was discovered in 1916 and would yield the highest recovery per acre of any oil field that has ever been discovered in the Rocky Mountains. When cattlemen drove cattle to or through Carbon County in the early 1870s, they were British and of the Longhorn variety shown here. There's still Longhorn cattle in the county. These are owned by William McIntosh. In 1825, the Ashley Smith party crossed the Laramie Plains on their way to the Green River Rendezvous. The 25 members of the expedition entered the county from the southeast at Arlington, followed the foothills of the Medicine Bow Range, and then traveled west past the present site of the town of Elk Mountain. They then crossed the North Platte River near Emigrants Crossing and journeyed past the present site of Rawlins. This group then turned north and entered the Great Divide Basin, leaving it at Lamont, and traveled thence on to the Sweetwater River. The famous explorer Kit Carson was also one of the first white men to visit Carbon County. He trapped and hunted with a Captain Gaunt and his party in the North Park area southeast of encampment. Kit Carson was involved in an Indian battle on the Little Snake River, known as Battle Creek, in September of 1839. And then there was the severe, unprecedented winter of 1845. Frigid Arctic storms howled in from the north and killed thousands of buffalo, deer, elk, and antelope. Many of the horses and ponies of the trappers and Indians froze to death. It was one of the worst storms on record, and it stymied the explorers' and trappers' journeys through Carbon County at the time. The Cherokee Trail was named for a party of Cherokee Indians traveling to the California Gold Rush in 1849. The party consisted of 40 wagons and 130 persons led by Captain Lewis Evans. This is the first instance of a train of wagons crossing Carbon County. The Cherokee Trail, or Evans Trace as it was sometimes called, followed explorer John C. Fremont's route during an expedition in 1843 to the vicinity of Bridger Pass in Carbon County. But the party missed the pass and crossed the Continental Divide at Jepp's Canyon and continued west approximately along the present line of the Union Pacific Railroad. One of the backdrops for the first white travelers in the northwest portion of Carbon County is the Ferris Mountains. This mountain range is quite unique in that most of the water on the south side all runs into the Sweetwater River to the west, and on the north side, almost all of the water flows into the Platte River to the east. The Continental Divide crosses the Ferris Peak, which is the highest peak in the Ferris Mountain Range at 10,035 feet. And according to Ripley, the Ferris Range is the only mountain range in the world that runs east to west. Now, let's take a look at the Great Divide Basin. The Great Divide Basin splits near Bridger Pass, and the eastern border crosses I-80 5.5 miles west of Rawlins. The western portion is between Tipton and Table Rock. This basin is on top of the continent and is approximately 3,900 square miles in size. The elevation ranges from 6,500 feet near the center to more than 8,000 feet along the borders. The Great Divide Basin, sometimes called the Red Desert, is an area where water that collects there cannot leave as surface runoff, but eventually evaporates. In 1862, because of Indian troubles on the Oregon Trail, the Overland Stage Company changed its route to the general route of the Cherokee Trail, thereby establishing the Overland Trail. It was established by Ben Holliday's famous Overland Stagecoach Company, and it operated until 1866. There were stations 10 to 15 miles apart and were of two types, home and swing. At home stations, meals were served and the drivers and horses were changed, while at swing stations, only the horses were changed. These were at Bridger Pass, Fort Halleck, Pass Creek, Sage Creek, and Pine Grove. The three home stations in Carbon County were at Rock Creek, or Arlington, North Platte Crossing, and Sulphur Springs. The stagecoaches were drawn by 6 horses and normally had a seating capacity of 9 persons and traveled at an average speed of 8 miles an hour. The establishment of the Sulphur Springs Stage Station on the Overland Trail in 1862 was located along Muddy Creek, about 10 miles south of the notorious Muddy Creek Massacre. It was a home station for the Overland Stage Line and also housed U.S. Army troops for the protection of travelers. Here, passengers were fed and the stagecoach horses were changed. The station and adjacent buildings were constructed of stone and the roofs were made of compacted dirt. Occupants dug tunnels to the creek for water gathering so they would not be exposed to the sharp-eyed Indian parties. They also dug rifle pits at various locations near the station to always have a ready supply of guns and ammo for protection. Near the site, an old cemetery still stands with the remains of those who died from the harsh Carbon County environment of the time. Just a short 6 years later, in the spring and summer of 1868, because of the advance of the railroad, the stage line along the Overland Trail was abandoned. Yet, Sulphur Springs continued to be a station for the new Rawlins White River stage line, which traveled by the same site. The Overland Trail, where many of the first settlers of the West traveled, is one of Carbon County's most premier features. Entering Wyoming at Virginia Dale, the trail wound north of the Medicine Bow Range through the Laramie Plains and Elk Mountain, over the Platte River or Emigrant's Crossing onto Bridger Pass, thence north along Muddy Creek to Sulphur Springs and on to Washakie and Duck Lake stations. The Platte River Crossing was a home stage station on the Overland Trail located on the North Platte River about halfway between the I-80 bridge and Saratoga. A ferry was established near the crossing in 1866 to transport stagecoaches and route wagons by W.E. Bennett, who operated the ferry and also ranched in the late 1880s. W.E. Bennett came to the area in July of 1864. He and Reed Rupp operated the ferry from November of 1866 until high water washed it away in the spring. Bennett then started Bennett's Ferry 2.5 miles upriver. Historical features here include a staircase cut out of a rock to the top of the bluff on the east side. On the west side are rocks into which have been carved the names of the many pioneers who passed by on their journeys. Ben Holliday established the Overland Stagecoach Company and operated it until 1866. At that time, he sold the line to the Wells Fargo Company. Despite frequent attacks by Indians, Holliday was able to keep his stage stops and the route open, carrying the mail immigrants, and other passengers. Throngs of westbound immigrants traveled the route, of course, many of which fell victim to harsh winters, Indian raids, diseases, and accidents. Numerous grave sites are located along the route where a surprisingly high number of immigrants and their children are buried. According to legend, reports are that on each side of the Overland Trail, along its full length, there are at least 10 grave sites per mile. Some of the most famous American explorers entered Carbon County in the 1800s and passed on or near the Overland Trail. Jim Bridger, the famous mountain man and trapper, first came to the county in 1840. 10 years later, he returned as guide of the Captain Howard Stansbury expedition. It was on this trip that the Strategic Pass was named after him. Bridger Pass was mapped by Stansbury and would later act as an important stage stop on the Overland Trail. A notched log cabin with a sod and rock roof still stands at the stage station site. Lieutenant F.T. Bryan followed Bridger's footsteps in 1856 and 1857 and improved the trail through the pass. Bryan returned again in 1858 as a member of the Utah expedition, accompanied by U.S. cavalry troops. Another famous pioneer to come to Carbon County was mountain man Jim Baker. He settled in the Little Snake River Valley in the southern portion of Carbon County. Known as a vigorous trapper and trailblazer, Baker was famous for his skirmishes with area Indians and his taming of the frontier, if you will. One battle in which he was involved was at Frabe's Post, a small fort built by pioneer Henry Frabe and Jim Bridger in 1837. It was located east of the present site of Savory. With Frabe in command, Baker and a small band of other settlers fought a fierce battle in August of 1841 against an overwhelming band of Indians. Frabe was killed in the skirmish. History seekers can view Baker's cabin, a fortress-like two-story affair, plus his famous log-hewn canoe and other memorabilia of the times at the museum grounds at Savory. Baker is buried just west of Savory at a cemetery reserved exclusively for him and his descendants. To be sure, a white man entering what is now Carbon County in the 1800s did so at his own risk. Indians were indeed not receptive to the intrusion of the trappers and settlers, and many battles and skirmishes occurred. One area that was particularly dangerous was a vast open area called No Man's Land. This dangerous spot was located in the east central portion of present-day Carbon County, approximately south of the Shirley Mountains and between Elk Mountain and Bridger Pass. The reason this area was so dangerous was that no Indian tribe actually controlled it, and it was literally surrounded by various nations. To the west, the Shoshone. To the north, the Crow. And northeast resided the Sioux. Southeast of No Man's Land were the Cheyenne and Arapaho. The Utes were found in the mountains to the south. Hence, any white party traveling this area was subject to attack by each of these tribes. These frequent Indian attacks prompted the U.S. Army to establish several posts in Carbon County for the protection of settlers and travelers. One such fort was constructed in 1862 and was abandoned as a military post in 1868. This military post was named Fort Halleck and was located just west of the present site of Elk Mountain, the remains of which are still visible today at the site, which is owned by the Palm Livestock Company. Military troops were stationed here to protect westward adventurers who traveled on the Overland Trail and on the Overland Stage Line. Fort Halleck was named after George W. Halleck and was manned by Civil War soldiers from Ohio and Kansas until it was closed in 1866 on July the 4th. One terrible skirmish occurred in no man's land in October of 1868 at Bloody Lake, which is located about halfway between the towns of Percy and Fort Halleck. 7 men who were part of a tie train were camped at the lake when, without warning, a band of 35 Indians attacked. Only one of the whites had arms, hence the reason why 4 of the 7 in the tie train were killed. The others escaped by seeking safety in the rocks. The lake received its macabre name because the Indians threw the dead into the water and the lake literally turned a blood red in color. As a matter of interest, nearby Elk Mountain was first named Medicine Bow Butte for the Indians' excellent bow-making materials, or good medicine, which they found along the banks of the nearby Medicine Bow River. The name of the peak was eventually changed in 1856 for the large population of elk which roamed its slopes at the time. Another famous Carbon County fort the U.S. Army established to protect westbound travelers as well as construction crews constructing the first U.S. transcontinental railroad to pass through the area was Fort Fred Steele. Founded in 1868, the fort was quite large and contained all the amenities of the time, including rock corrals, a saloon, spacious bunkhouses, and a company store. Fenimore Chatterton, later governor of Wyoming, built an impressive home at Fort Steele. Just across the North Platte River from the fort was the Carbon Timber Company. Located to the east of the fort on 497 acres, the site once supported a box factory, sawmill, tie loading plant, main boom, company store, and a company town. Among other items, wooden doors for coal and grain cars and railroad ties were manufactured here. The timber used at the sawmill was floated down the North Platte River from various tributaries upstream during the high water months of May and June, sometimes in quantities as high as 500,000 to 1 million logs and ties. For over 50 years, the spring-swollen Platte brought the ties which were cut in the forest, pushed into smaller tributaries like Brush Creek, French Creek, Billy Creek, Douglas Creek, and the Encampment River. Standing in the cold, swirling streams, the drivers used their pike poles and their agility to bring the ties and the timbers to the landing at Fort Steele. Fort Steele was eventually abandoned in 1886, the soldiers having protected the traveling pioneers and railroad workers well. Some of the buildings at the fort and at Carbon Timber Company still stand today. The state of Wyoming maintains the remains of the fort for visitors, and there are interpretive and informational sites there. It's located just north of Interstate 80 between Sinclair and Walcott Junction. In the summer of 1868, what is now Carbon County was invaded by a formidable force of 10,000 men with almost as many animals. This was the Union Pacific Construction Crew on its way to Promontory Point. Engaged in a race with the Central Pacific, the crew, led by the Casement brothers, General Jack and Dan, laid track with military precision. This immense assembly line moved parallel to the Overland Trail, leaving behind its product, the first transcontinental railroad. In a sandstone hill on St. Mary's Creek east of Walcott, the first tunnel on the Union Pacific and the only tunnel in Wyoming was dug and timbered. By July 15th, the track was at Fort Steele, and on July 25th, it had already made its way to Rawlins, then known as Rawlins Springs. Here, a 10-stall roundhouse was built for the railroad. At Medicine Bow, a 5-stall roundhouse was constructed. In only 38 days, the Union Pacific Line was laid a distance of 60 miles. The railroad created a tenuous line of civilization across Carbon County and became the staging and supply points for further settlements north and south of the railroad route. Eventually, the Lincoln Highway, also known as US 30, opened Wyoming up to further development. More than a few famous people of the times visited Carbon County in the mid to late 1800s, when the area was being tamed and developed, including several presidents. Ulysses S. Grant, who later became President of the United States, visited Fort Steele and the little town of Benton in July of 1868 while campaigning for the presidency. Schuyler Colfax, who later became Grant's vice president, visited Carbon County in June of 1865 while traveling by stagecoach on the Overland Trail. At the time, Colfax was Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and had to be provided with a military escort due to Indian uprisings in the area. President Grant again visited Carbon County in October of 1875 when he journeyed to Medicine Bow, and President Chester A. Arthur left the train in Rawlins in June of 1883 to then take a mule-drawn ambulance for the rest of his journey to Yellowstone National Park. In 1878, as a member of the Henry Draper Eclipse expedition, the inventor Thomas Edison, while fishing at Battle Lake, was inspired by the frayed ends of his bamboo fishing rod, which in turn aided him in inventing the incandescent electric lamp. Besides famous people, famous and noteworthy events also took place in Carbon County in the 1800s. As just one example, a Major O'Farrell, commanding Company A of the 11th Ohio Cavalry, seized and destroyed 1 barrel of whiskey at a gap on the western end of the Ferris Mountains near the present site of Muddy Gap in 1862. Named Whiskey Gap for the incident, it was the first official raid and prohibition enforcement of record in the United States. It was reported that the whiskey was dumped in a nearby creek and some soldiers imbibed in the mixture. Whether or not this is fact or fancy remains to be proven, however. Another historic event of the times was the establishment of the Western Union Telegraph line along the route of the Overland Trail. But it was abandoned within 3 years after construction due to the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. Yes, times were definitely changing in Carbon County, and soon towns would begin to spring up and commerce begin to grow. In this section of the Carbon County Centennial video, we'll take a look at the fascinating history surrounding some of the towns and cities of the county. Our first stop is Saratoga, located in the south-central portion of the county. Its name is derived from the Iroquois Indian language and means place of the miraculous water in the rock. It was called this for the famous hot springs which lie on the town's eastern edge. The hot springs, with temperatures that range from 117 to 128 degrees, were a meeting place for Indian tribes of the area long before the white man ventured west. The Arapaho, Ute, and Shoshone tribes gathered here on numerous occasions, and even though they may have been at war with each other, the Indians never fought at the hot spring site. The Saratoga hot springs were thought by the natives to be spiritual and to have healing properties. When the white man arrived in the area, the Indians caught his diseases, smallpox being one of the earliest and most devastating. They treated this malady in their traditional way by immersing smallpox victims in the hot springs, then in turn dousing them in the ice-cold waters of the Platte River. This severe method caused many deaths. Thus, the Indians concluded that the springs had become inhabited by an evil spirit. Eventually, they abandoned the site altogether as a place of healing and renewal. One of the first settlers who came to Saratoga was William H. Caldwell. Caldwell first visited the area on a hunting trip in 1866, and at the time, Saratoga was simply known as Warm Springs. Fenimore Chatterton renamed Warm Springs in 1884 and called it Saratoga. Caldwell returned in 1872 and decided to stay. He built a cabin and bathhouses next to the hot springs and went into business selling tickets to bathe in the warm water, and also offered meals and sundries for visitors. A well was dug and the water would be bottled and sold by a J.D. Paulson to customers throughout the United States for its purported miraculous healing properties. Caldwell's enterprising business was the advent of commerce in the town of Saratoga and was located near the present site of the Saratoga Inn. The hot springs bathing area has been improved over the years, most recently in the 1970s by the city of Saratoga when a public swimming pool was installed. Bathers come from all over the world each year to take a dip in the soothing waters. In 1883, Caldwell sold his operation and went into business with a fellow by the name of Hawker to construct a grandiose hotel on the west side of the spring. It was simply known as Hot Springs Hotel. From those beginnings, Saratoga started to grow and develop. Businesses and homes sprouted up, and cottonwood trees, planted and nourished by the settlers, began to make their appearance. The industries which supported the town then are still those which support it today: lumber, recreation, and ranching. The bridge over the North Platte River, completed in 1885, really enhanced the town at the time. Active businesses were located at both ends, and it allowed for the easy flow of commerce back and forth, and for the smooth passage of the slower horse and pedestrian traffic. Although the original bridge collapsed in 1943, it was rebuilt on a solid concrete foundation, over which traffic still moves today. One of the early famous buildings in Saratoga was the Gold Hill House, also known as the Landis Hotel. It became popular with miners who came to the area in the 1890s during a local gold rush. Miners poured through the town, stopping to purchase the tools and supplies that they would need to find their fortune. Besides comfortable lodging, the hotel was famous for its excellent meals, which were described in an 1891 commentary in the local newspaper as being second to none. About 1894, Saratoga entered the annals of woman history when two sisters, Laura and Gertrude Huntington, were the first women in the state to edit a paper. Saratoga was eventually incorporated in August of 1900 after several violent crimes were committed. The city fathers and local townsfolk voted overwhelmingly to provide both legal and police protection for the citizens. 6 years later, electricity arrived in Saratoga and the town progressed even further. A volunteer fire department was formed in 1923 and was headed by prominent local businessman E.J. Shively. The local airport, built in the 1930s with WPA labor, was named in honor of Lieutenant Jack Shively, who lost his life in World War II. Constructed by the town of Saratoga and the Saratoga Lions Club, Shively Field was dedicated in 1952. The airport has been improved dramatically since that time, and today its 8,400-foot lighted runway can accommodate the largest corporate jet. Saratoga still flourishes today and is known throughout the country for its fabulous fishing in the nearby North Platte River. There were no trout in the Platte River until trout were stocked around 1889 or 1890. The town of Carbon, which lies about 20 miles to the southeast, also has an interesting yet tragic history. Large veins of coal 16 feet thick were discovered at Carbon, and mining began in the 1860s. A report to the Union Pacific Railway Company on September 20th, 1868, cited 100 tons of semi-bituminous coal as being extracted each day from area pits. Because of these rich coal deposits, the town of Carbon literally sprung from the desert floor. In the early years, the first Carbon settlers were from the British Isles, and their roots were steeped in a centuries-old mining tradition. Soon followed the Scandinavians, especially those of Finnish descent. The lively camp prospered despite few resources to build homes, Indian attacks, scarce water, mountain and typhoid fever. At various times, there were 7 working mines at Carbon, and work in the pits continued despite labor problems, explosions, and cave-ins. A cemetery near the old camp still stands today as a reminder of the hazards and dangers of the era. Some of the gravestones and markers look as if they had just been erected yesterday, and the cemetery has kept a tidy appearance in spite of the harsh desert elements. People are still being buried at the site. In 1890, a fire destroyed half of the town. Some residents reported that it was started by a hotel boarder who overturned a kerosene lamp, but the origin wasn't verified. In any case, a new Carbon, though destined to be short-lived, rose from the ashes. The town was platted, streets were constructed, and the town once again took on the air of civilization. But it wasn't long thereafter, in 1889, that the Union Pacific Coal Company discovered the richer beds of coal at Hanna. That would prove to be the death knell for the town of Carbon. 10 years later, the coal company prepared to abandon the site for mining, and the place fast became a ghost town, with most miners having already moved to work in the mines in Hanna. Others moved further west to new jobs. Hanna emerged in 1889 when a company of workmen opened mines in the area and began to develop the town. The first housing was in the form of wall tents, and that first winter, the conditions were nearly unbearable due to the cold. Most of the miners who worked the Hanna coal mines were single men. Those that were married had families who resided in nearby Carbon, where housing afforded warmth and some amenities. But it wasn't long, within the first year as a matter of fact, that the town actually began to take shape. A company store and a school were built, although there were no pupils. Streets and alleys were constructed, and groups of houses began to spring up. Within a few years, the population of Hanna had reached 1,500 people and boasted a doctor, a hospital, and a wonderful water supply which was piped in from the foothills of Elk Mountain. There were bands and orchestras and churches and lodges. Hanna had finally come of age. According to the history of the Union Pacific Coal Company, mining was carried on with picks and powder, and the haulage was by mules. The miners descended into the pit with their carbide lamps and round metal dinner buckets. Although the coal mines at Hanna were bountiful, they were also very dangerous. On June 30th, 1903, a terrible gas explosion in mine number 1, which was described as sounding like a heavy charge of dynamite and rock, occurred deep inside, and many lost their lives. According to the state inspector's report, 172 men were in the mine. It was reported that all died. It took 10 months to recover the bodies. All were presumably recovered except one. Again in 1908, on March 28th, the mine exploded twice, this time claiming 59 lives. 18 men lost their lives in the first explosion and the remainder in the second. It took from March 28th of that year into July to recover the bodies of 32 men. The 27 remain in mine number 1. The monument on the hill above the mine was erected in memory of those killed in the Hanna Basin area, Carbon, Elmo, and Peacock mines. The other of more recent origin in the town of Hanna is dedicated to all miners who were killed in accidents in the Hanna and Carbon mines. Additional names are coming to light as more research is done, and their names will be added to this monument. These tragedies brought the widows and their victims and the remaining miners and their families very close together to form a caring and close-knit community. Because of the large coal reserves, Hanna continued to prosper until 1954. Most of the Union Pacific locomotives switched from being powered by coal to diesel. The Carbon County town of Walcott grew because of its location on the rail line. At the turn of the century, Walcott was the busiest shipping point on the Union Pacific line between Omaha, Nebraska, and Ogden, Utah. Walcott's claim to fame in a large regard was sheep. This subject has a bit of interesting history. Two brothers by the name of Cosgriff had a large sheep operation near Fort Fred Steele and used the pens there to shear their sheep. But they ran into one major problem. Due to the close proximity of Hanson's Saloon, their shearing crew made too many visits to imbibe in the spirits, thus becoming quite ineffective in their shearing duties. Despite repeated requests by the Cosgriffs, Hanson refused to close his saloon for the duration of the shearing season. So the Cosgriff brothers moved their operation to Walcott in 1905. In that year alone, over 80,000 sheep moved through Walcott pens. The wool, of course, being shipped on the Union Pacific Railroad. The original pens and enclosures, by the way, form part of the present shearing facility, which is located 2 miles northwest of Walcott Junction. Copper also contributed to Walcott's prosperity at the time, when the mines of the Grand Encampment Mining District were thriving in the early part of the century. The big copper ingots were brought to Walcott by freight wagons for shipment. In addition, the Scribner stage lines passed through the area, and the Walcott Hotel became a popular stopping place for travelers. As mentioned earlier, Grand Encampment, now known simply as Encampment, was an important copper mining center in the late 1890s and the early part of this century. But what first drew white men to the area was the abundance of beaver, highly prized for their valuable pelts. Soon to follow the trappers were the homesteaders and ranchers who began to arrive in the 1870s. And then in 1897, copper was discovered by Ed Hegarty in the nearby Sierra Madre Mountains, and life changed dramatically for area residents. Hundreds of miners migrated into the area. Soon thereafter, Grand Encampment City and nearby Dodgette began to grow, along with a number of other satellite settlements. To accommodate all of the ore that was being mined, the Boston, Wyoming smelter was built on the outskirts of town and was equipped with a 16.5-mile aerial tramway which transported the raw ore from the Ferris Hagerty mine. At the time, it was the longest tramway of its kind in the world. Supplied by the famous Ferris Hagerty mine and others, the smelter processed hundreds of tons of copper ore. As a matter of fact, the mines in the Sierra Madres would produce $2 million worth of copper from 1877 to 1908. It was 1908 that the copper mining activity around Grand Encampment came to an abrupt halt. Due to fraudulent stock sales and overcapitalization, as well as falling copper prices, the small boom towns of Rudella, Dillon, Coppertown, Rambler, Battle, and Elwood began to close. Ironically, the same year that the mining halted, a rail line, which was supposed to have hauled the copper ore from Encampment to Walcott, was completed. Another Carbon County town of historic note located in the eastern part of the county is Medicine Bow. The town was the setting for author Owen Wister's famous novel, The Virginian, in which the famous phrase, "When you call me that, smile," was coined. Medicine Bow is also the home of the historic Virginian Hotel, built in 1909 by August Grimm. Today, visitors can view the hotel's elegant turn-of-the-century dining room, bar, and guest rooms, which have been preserved remarkably well. Just across the street from the hotel sits Owen Wister's original pioneer cabin. It was relocated to the site from northwestern Wyoming. Next to it is the old Union Pacific Rail Station, which was built in 1912. And if you really want to talk ancient Carbon County history, consider Como Bluff, located 7 miles east of Medicine Bow. Here lies the remains of dinosaurs 180 million years old. Part of the Morrison Formation, Como Bluff is one of the most significant fossil beds ever discovered in the United States. The discovery was made in 1877, and at the site, a museum was constructed of 5,796 dinosaur bones weighing over 102,000 pounds. It was aptly titled, "The Oldest Building in the World." Other places in Carbon County of historical significance include Arlington and Elk Mountain. Now, Arlington was an important stage stop on the Overland Trail in the 1860s and was a home station to weary travelers. The town included a combination dance hall, saloon, gambling den, blacksmith shop, and large piece-or-piece barn, which still stands today, remarkably well preserved. The words piece or piece refer to the manner in which horizontal logs were stacked, one on top of the other, by means of inserting a flange on the end of each log into a groove created in the corner and connecting posts. 17 miles west of Arlington is the community of Elk Mountain, which lies at the base of the landmark peak for which it was named. And it was also in the path of the Overland Trail. It was known as the crossing by early settlers and mountain men who traveled the trail on their journey west. Here you'll find a pioneer church, the historic Elk Mountain Hotel, another piece-or-piece barn, and of more recent vintage, the famous Garden Spot Pavilion Dance Hall, where many of the big bands of the 1940s and 50s played. In 1910, the Ohio Oil Company discovered oil in the ranch country near Rock River on the eastern edge of Carbon County. Ohio Oil eventually constructed an impressive company town, which was named McFadden, after Ohio Oil's district supervisor. The community, which was extremely isolated before the coming of the interstate, was close-knit and included nearby ranchers and their families. Today, many of McFadden's buildings have been moved or razed. The population is far fewer than the 1,500 it was at the peak of the boom. Taking our historic journey to the southwestern part of the county, near the Colorado border, we enter the Little Snake River Valley, home of the little towns of Dixon, Savory, and Baggs. This, as we described in another portion of the Carbon County Centennial video, was Jim Baker country, the place where the old mountain man roamed and trapped, the site of many Indian skirmishes. It was also the home for a while to the notorious outlaw Butch Cassidy. And Baggs, which was named for a New Mexico cattle rancher who settled in the valley in 1870, sits the Matthews House, which Butch Cassidy helped build according to legend. In Dixon still stands the home of a doctor whom Cassidy kidnapped in the middle of the night to help save the life of an outlaw friend who had been wounded. Dixon has a number of other historic buildings, including one of the first pioneer cabins in the valley, the old Mercantile, the first Dixon Bank building, the old flour mill, and brick kiln. In Savory, on the Little Snake River Museum grounds, a pioneer schoolhouse, the famous Blair House, and other memorabilia of days gone by, including Jim Baker's cabin, are on display for history-seeking visitors. Savory was named after a French trapper who hunted along a nearby creek, which also bears his name. In Baggs, still standing, are the first bank building, complete with the pillared architecture of the times, the first gas station, or what was known then as a filling station, the old Mercantile, the first homestead, and the historic dance hall. In another section of the Carbon County Centennial video, we'll take a look at more of the history of the county and the towns which formed its foundation. In this section of the Carbon Centennial video, we continue with a look at the history of the towns within the county and near its borders, and some vital county statistics and important dates. First of all, let's take an historical visit to Rawlins, presently the largest community in the county. The town was named for General John A. Rawlins, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in the late 1800s. The summer of 1867 near Cheyenne, Rawlins joined General Grenville M. Dodge and a party of civil engineers who were surveying a route westward from Omaha to Wyoming. As they continued on their journey and approached the hills overlooking the present town site of Rawlins, General Rawlins made a request for a drink of good, cool water. A detachment of scouts were sent out to explore the countryside and discovered a spring near the base of the hills. The water was pure, cold, and free of alkali. After drinking it, Rawlins stated that it was the most refreshing drink he had ever tasted, and exclaimed that should anything ever be named after him, he hoped it would be a spring of water. General Dodge immediately named that spot Rawlins Springs. Later, the site became an important division point on the Union Pacific Railroad, and a town flourished there. The name was eventually shortened to Rawlins, and the community remains the commercial center for the county. As to General Rawlins, he later became Secretary of War in the cabinet of President Grant. Rawlins' past is a colorful one, and one of the most interesting historical features which still stands is the Wyoming Frontier Prison. Built in 1890 and used until 1981, the old prison was home to train robbers, highwaymen, horse thieves, and cattle rustlers during Wyoming's more lawless days. Perhaps the most notorious prisoner incarcerated there was William Carlisle, also known as Parlor Car Bill, whose 4 train robberies and 1 prison escape netted him a life sentence in 1916. But he was released in 1936 due to good behavior and authored a book which gives good insight as to the legal workings of the state of Wyoming at the time. Contrary to popular notion, the famous outlaws Butch Cassidy and Tom Horn were never imprisoned at the 5th Street Academy, as it was sometimes called. Built entirely of Wyoming sandstone blocks, the prison was recently placed in the National Historic Register, and public tours are conducted from Memorial Day to Labor Day. Big Nose George, a notorious outlaw who ambushed and murdered 2 deputies near Elk Mountain in 1878, was hanged by a group of vigilantes in downtown Rawlins in 1881. Rawlins' history is also centered around its turn-of-the-century buildings, the majority of which are well preserved and available for viewing today via what is called the Downtown Walking Tour. One of the most famous buildings is Ferris Mansion, built in 1903 in classic Queen Victorian style by mining magnate George Ferris. Another historical site is the Rawlins Key Bank building. Built in 1882 of native stone, the bank was the first in Wyoming to receive a charter on May 26, 1890, 6 weeks before Wyoming became a state. Rawlins was also famous for its metallic paint mine. Called Rawlins Red, this paint was used for many years to cover New York's Brooklyn Bridge. Other important historical buildings in Rawlins include St. Joseph Church, the Osborne Building, the France Memorial Presbyterian Church in 1882, and the Miller Block built in 1907. There is also the Rawlins State Bank, which received its charter on January 2, 1899, and later on June 9, 1990, changed its name to Rawlins National Bank. And also of historic note is the Masonic Lodge and the Blake House. Also related to Rawlins, legend has it that Jim Hansen, who was one of the starters of the Hansen-Ferguson Mercantile Store, imported Percheron horses from France, and when some escaped, this was the beginning of the wild horse herd in the county. And if you really want to talk ancient history, consider the Rawlins Uplift, which is in a 4 to 5 mile radius of the town and is formed of Precambrian rocks which are dated 260 million years old. These giant Precambrian rocks slope to 42,000 feet or 8 miles below the surface, and stretch as far as Hanna, forming the deepest structural basin in North America. This unique formation contains a greater spread of geological time than any other rock formation along Interstate 80 between New York and San Francisco. North of Rawlins, near the site of where the first white man entered the county at Lost Soldier Gap, is Bear Oil, located just across the Carbon County border, a site which has some of the richest oil reserves in the state. The first oil well was drilled here in 1916, and the area has been a large producer ever since. The town of Bear Oil was named for a man called Bear, one of the first oil drillers to tap the area, and he established the Bear Oil Company, which later became the Producers and Refiners Corporation. The large Wirtz oil field, located just east of Bear Oil, was named after the famous oil man Red Wirtz. And presently, with the help of CO2 injection, this field produces over 4,000 barrels of the rich black liquid per day. The first post office came to Bear Oil in 1924, and shortly thereafter a public school was built. In order to process all of the oil that was being drilled in the Bear Oil or Lost Soldier and the nearby Ferris fields, Producers and Refiners Corporation needed a large refinery located on the Union Pacific Transcontinental Trunk Line from which to transport finished oil products. The present site of Sinclair was formerly known as Parco. The Parco name was taken from the initials of the Producers and Refiners Corporation. In March of 1923, construction of the refinery was completed at a cost of $10 million. Quite a hefty sum, especially in those days. Water was supplied via a pipeline which tapped into the North Platte River at Old Fort Steele, and soon a town began to grow where heretofore only sagebrush grew. The capacity of the new refinery was 10,000 barrels per day, and when the formal opening was held in 1925, people from all over the country attended. The town of Parco, which grew around the refinery, had all of the amenities of the times and was designed by Denver businessman Frank Kistler. One of the premier architectural attractions of the town was the Parco Bar and Hotel, built in classic California style and aptly titled the first mall in Wyoming. Covering an entire city block, the hotel housed, among other offerings, a restaurant, drugstore, doctor's office, barber shop, beauty parlor, a haberdashery, shoe repair shop, a garage, and a tailor shop. Tragedy struck the new town on April 6, 1927, when within the refinery, the Dub Still No. 3 exploded. 22 men were on duty at the time, and 15 were killed instantly by the fire which accompanied the explosion. But the town soon recovered and the refinery expanded, eventually to take up nearly a full section of land. The name of the town and the refinery were changed to Sinclair on May 21, 1934, when the Sinclair Oil Company bought the refinery. Today, due to more development, this impressive refinery east of Rawlins and visible from Interstate 80 has the capacity to process 42,000 barrels of oil per day, making it the largest facility of its kind in the state. The town of Wamsutter, just outside of Carbon County's western boundary, was created when the Union Pacific Railroad built its tracks through the area in 1868. It was first called Washakie, named for the famous Shoshone Indian chief Washakie. The name Washakie was changed to Wamsutter between 1885 and 1886. Some say it was renamed after the Indian chief Wanosutta, which means young heart. Others say it was named for the textile mills in Europe. In any event, Wamsutter's claim to fame was wool. 29 different sheep companies ran their sheep through Wamsutter at various times. For many years, the town was supported by the railroad and sheep companies. In 1939, the Stena Line Oil Company built a pipeline through the town from Rangley Oil Field, making the area a key station, pumping oil to both east and west coasts. Now that we've looked at some of the important history of the towns of Carbon County, let's explore some important dates, events, and significant facts. Carbon County was formed in December of 1868 by the 8th Legislative Assembly of what was then the Dakota Territory. The Wyoming Territory, which included Carbon, along with Carter, Albany, and Laramie counties, would be created the following year on May 19, 1869. The county spanned the entire length of the state, from Colorado to Montana. Later in 1875, land was annexed from the county to form the present Johnson and Sheridan counties, and in 1888, land was also annexed to form the present Natrona County. Formal government was formed in the county in 1880, and Rawlins, then known as Rawlins Springs, was and still is the county seat. The name Carbon was derived from the extensive coal deposits in the region, and the county was officially given the name in 1869. Carbon County has 7,991 square miles within its borders, or 5,114,240 acres. It has 16,660 acres of water surface. The ownership of land is as follows. Federal land, 2,775,717 acres. State and local land, 338,917 acres. And private land, 1,999,606 acres. Of the 23 Wyoming counties, Carbon is the third largest in area, spanning from near the Continental Divide on the north end to the Colorado border on the south. Elevations range from 5,000 feet on the valley floors to over 12,000 feet in the spectacular and awe-inspiring snowy range east of Saratoga. Carbon County is bounded on three sides with abrupt mountain ranges, with the western edge a level plain along the rim of the Red Desert. It consists largely of high, semi-arid plateaus cut by broad, fertile valleys and watered by the North Platte River and its tributaries. As mentioned in earlier sections of our video presentation, the Continental Divide and portions of the Great Divide Basin run through the county. The annual precipitation is from 10 to 15 inches, while the average snowfall is 41.5 inches. The growing season in the county is from 86 to 126 days, depending on the elevation and the wind, which seems to be an ever-present factor here. It averages a velocity of 16 miles per hour. The average relative temperature is 42.0 degrees. The county's main resources are minerals, coal, natural gas, uranium, and lumber, with total commercial acreage of forest land being at 631,796. Major agricultural products include cattle, sheep, wool, hay, honey, and grain. Carbon County ranks first in Wyoming for production of tons of hay, third in sheep production, fourth in lamb feeding, fifth in the state for honey production, and sixth in total cattle produced. The county is rated very high for production of stock sheep and wool in both the state and the country. It is fourth in the nation in sheep production. Wildlife is also abundant and includes such species as pronghorn antelope, Rocky Mountain elk, Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, mule deer, sage grouse, migratory ducks, geese, and mourning doves, not to mention abundant non-game and predatory animals. Carbon County is renowned as a sportsman's paradise, and hunters come from throughout the U.S. each fall to hunt within its borders. As a matter of interest, the Wyoming state fish, the cutthroat trout, the Wyoming state flower, the Indian paintbrush, the Wyoming state bird, the meadowlark, the state tree, the cottonwood, and the Wyoming state gem, jade, all abound within Carbon County. The official Wyoming state animal is the bison. An important fact to remember about the history of Carbon County is that it was under the flags of 6 different countries or principalities at one time or another: England, France, Spain, the republics of Mexico, Texas, and of course, the United States. But it wasn't until 1868 that Carbon County actually became a part of the Wyoming territorial government. From 1861 to 1863, the county was under the jurisdiction of the Nebraska Territory. From 1863 to 1864, the Idaho Territory was given control. And then, as mentioned earlier, the Dakota Territory controlled Carbon County from 1864 through 1868. The territorial capital was at present-day Yankton, South Dakota. Interestingly enough, the U.S. territorial governments, which at one time or another had control over Carbon County, were Louisiana, Missouri, Utah, Nebraska, Idaho, Dakota, and Texas. Keep in mind now that these original territories were much larger than the present-day states which bear the same names. Exchanges and control of land within Carbon County also took place with the signing and enactment of various Indian treaties. In 1851, what was known as the Fort Laramie Treaty gave the Southern Arapaho and Cheyenne Indian nations parts of the county east of the North Platte River. But in 1861, the somewhat dubious Fort Wise Treaty took those same lands away from the Arapaho and Cheyenne and returned control back to the U.S. During that period, the territory west of the North Platte River was still claimed by the Shoshone Nation and had been before the arrival of the white man in the area. Eventually came the Fort Bridger Treaty in 1868, under which all of the aforementioned tribes seceded their claims to these lands within the county and begrudgingly accepted the Wind River Indian Reservation as their new home. The trails through Carbon County used by mountain men, explorers, and stages in the 1800s indeed were bridges to the new frontier. And as was demonstrated in another section of the Carbon County Centennial video, the Overland, Cherokee, and as you will see, the Fort Washakie Meeker trails played an important part in the settling of Wyoming and the West, and the beginning of settlements and commerce which would make the territory flourish. As we look again at the Overland Trail, here marked in green, we can see that there were quite a few stage stations, both home and swing type, which aided in the protection and comfort of travelers. At one time, there were 11 stage stations within the county along the Overland Trail. As we now look at the Cherokee Trail, here marked in blue, one can see that the path closely approximates that of the Overland Trail, except that it passed south of Elk Mountain, and then, as it made its way past Bridger Pass, it goes north of the Continental Divide, here marked in orange. Otherwise, the two routes were fairly similar. There were no general patterns to the earliest trails through Carbon County, though several of them did probably form the foundation for the Cherokee and Overland trails. Taking a look now at the later explorer trails, we find that they pretty much followed the same routes, with the exception of Captain John C. Fremont's expeditions in 1843 and 1844. Another important trail in Carbon County was the Rawlins-Fort Washakie Trail. Established in 1868, this trail served as a key transportation link from the Wind River Indian Reservation and the Wind River Valley to Rawlins and the Southern Wyoming Territory, with the Union Pacific Rail line at Rawlins being the major access point for outside goods and services. In operation from 1868 to 1906, the Rawlins-Fort Washakie Trail began at the old Rankin Livery Stable on the corner of 5th and Cedar Streets in Rawlins and served an area from 133 to 152 miles north of town. Important county stage stops included Bell Springs, located 14 miles north, Bull Springs, 27.5 miles north, Separation Flats, 24 miles north, which later, by the way, replaced the Bull Springs station in 1887, and the famous Lost Soldier Station near Bear Oil. The route closely paralleled that of present-day U.S. Highway 287 and was an important commerce route for area settlers. Another important transportation aid in early Carbon County was the Pick Bridge, north of Saratoga. The construction contract was issued in 1908. The steel bridge allowed for the easy transport across the North Platte River for both commerce and travelers. Recently, through efforts of the Carbon County Historical Society, the Pick Bridge was preserved as an historical site. And our discussion of early Carbon County transportation wouldn't be complete without mentioning the old sheepherder's wagon, commonly referred to as the Ship of the Desert. This quaint covered wagon was a mobile home of sorts for the men who tended the large flocks on the Wyoming plains. It was reported that the first sheepherder wagon was built in 1884 in Rawlins by a blacksmith named James Candlish, and was designed as per the suggestions of early sheepmen. These ships of the desert can still be seen in use throughout Carbon County today. And so ends our third and final series of the Carbon County Centennial video. We hope you have enjoyed this look back into the past at the historical events, people, and places that shaped our county's future. We're proud that Carbon County is still a place where the old frontier lives. It's a place where the past is steeped in rich tradition, and where some say the old frontiersmen still roam the prairie with the drifting Wyoming wind.